So today's session will focus on lighting. We'll talk a little bit about how a lot of these prompt terms that we use can impact the overall aesthetic of the image, especially when it comes to understanding how to frame and compose a scene. The prompt terms that you use will have a significant impact on the resulting output. In this example, I've basically used a scribble sketch, a storyboard sketch of a car driving down the road. I generated that and used some control layers to kind of put sunset golden hour in the sky and kind of gave it a little bit of a look there. Ultimately, I think the power in having a strong vocabulary around some of the more commonly used terms in photography and describing the lighting. Something as simple as chiaroscuro gives you a lot of shadows with highlights. Knowing those terms really helps you hone it in and get the aesthetic that you're looking for. So that's what we'll focus on today. Let's clear our control layers. Let's make a square image here. And let's ask ourselves what type of lighting we want to do. Maybe we can look at some like interesting effects around just different frame and different compositions. So we will do something like a man in a leather jacket, real mountains in the background. Obviously, you know, cinematic film still is an interesting term. The lens is an interesting term. Some aesthetic terms are interesting there. But I'm going to take these out and we can create something from scratch. So we'll start with let's see, some prompt terms around the lighting. We'll go with kind of like we'll do dynamic lighting just as our like starting point, because that's a good base to use. There's a whole host of additional terms we'll play around with here. And then we'll focus on a little bit around the colors. So we'll say high contrast. And we will talk about the color palette. You know, we can use, we've kind of talked a little bit about using IP adapters as color before, and maybe we'll play around with that and adding that in. So I won't use any prompt terms yet. We'll generate without this, and then we'll get that going. And then we'll do maybe some camera. So we'll do like a medium shot, 70 millimeter lens. Do like soft gradients, and we'll add in lens flare just to see what that does for us. So I'm going to fix the seed. We're going to generate this and we're going to see what we get. And then we'll play around with it. Okay. So this is, we're doing tweaks here on this image in order to really understand if we can kind of like articulate and hone in on a specific style that we're going for. So we've got a guy being generated. There's mountains in the background. His face is a little bit funky. That's okay. We're just playing around with the lighting here. So the soft gradients and lens flare, there's a little bit of lens flare right there. The gradients have kind of smoothed this out. Let's see what happens when we take those terms out, right? Let's take out the soft gradients. Let's take out the lens flare. I anticipate overall composition is going to be pretty similar. Actually had a pretty big impact not having that lens flare in it. So we've got our man in a leather jacket. There's no lens flare anymore. So the sun is out of the image. And again, this is kind of like thinking about how these terms are going to influence the composition is interesting, right? What happens when there's lens flare? Typically, if you have lens flare, you have a source of light that's causing the lens flare. So adding the term lens flare, you can see that it added that kind of like source of light in the background and kind of compelled it to have this sun in the background that's causing this little kind of flare effect. When we take that out, we no longer have that in our image, and we're left with kind of the remainder of our prompt, which we've got dynamic lighting, high contrast, medium shot. Let's take this to extreme close-up shot. Kind of like see how the lighting changes if we get close up to the face and keep these same terms. So this is a little bit more on composition. We're talking about photography terms. So an extreme close-up, this is not really that extreme. It's more like just general close-up. Close-up was going to be like around the face. A medium shot's going to be like a little bit further away, waist up, and then a full shot or extremely long distance, is going to be kind of like way far off. So we've got a little bit more of a close-up, but we still have a lot of the same aesthetics here. And I'm curious where the black and white is coming from, because I guess maybe it's not, it might not be explicitly prompted for, but just the fact that we've got high contrast might be driving that up. So we'll say, instead of high contrast, let's change this to vibrant colors. See how that contrast piece changes it. We're getting some vibrant colors. All right, so we've got our high contrast, vibrant colors. What does high contrast do? It's creating lots of darks and lots of lights, right? So it's kind of moving towards this realm of wanting to be black and white because it's really easy to do high contrast stuff with black and white. That's kind of pushing it that way. When we switch that to vibrant colors, we obviously get something that's a little bit more what we're going for. If we say vibrant colors and high contrast, all of that together, I think we might get a little bit something that's like blown out, a little colors a little bit oversaturated maybe. We'll see. Okay, not too bad. He's got a little bit of a sultry look. He's got vibrant colors on his jacket, and that high contrast is seemingly mostly coming from the blacks in the jacket, with this like vibrant sheen on top of it. So I think it's interesting to play around with this. Somebody said high contrast is a black and white terminology. So it's the proposition here is that high contrast is directly correlated with a lot of the old black and white photography, and that's very likely. I think generally speaking, it's going to be a useful term. I think it's important to call out that while there may be terms that have certain meaning in kind of the categorical sense of how they're used and the language that we're familiar with, machine learning models are going to pick up something a little bit different from these. They're going to try to understand a certain pattern that's associated with it, and this will surely be correlated with that. But you can even use something like Chiaroscuro and still get colors. So we'll try Chiaroscuro just to kind of highlight that. What happens when we say vibrant colors in Chiaroscuro? And if you're not familiar with Chiaroscuro, again, it's kind of like a similar to high contrast. It's got like a lot of depth and shadows involved in it. But we can see here that when we combine that with the constraint of vibrant colors, it's still going to generate an image that has some amount of color in it. It's a little bit less vibrant color than our man in his kind of shiny jacket. But these key terms are doing a lot in the actual composition. We've got the same subject, right? A man in a leather jacket. Part of this is because we're using up-weighted terms, right? So these are overemphasized, and they might not change quite as much or as drastically if we had these normally weighted. But because these are high weights, we've bracketed these in parentheses and then put plus. We're kind of saying this is a term that needs a lot of attention. We should significantly focus on this term. And so you're going to get more oscillation in your output when you use weighting, because it's going to shift the overall conditioning that's going into the machine learning model in larger swings, right? You're like pushing it around in the latent space. We've got a couple of suggestions here, as well as some comments. So a few comments around terminology that people want to test, I think. High key or low key, which are lighting techniques. HDR, a tag that produces a good gradient of lights and darks. High key lighting, low key lighting, or more niche lighting terms like hatchet lighting, which is 2 key lights either side. So let's try that. That's interesting, right? Hatchet lighting. We've got that up-weighted, so it should have a pretty significant impact on our output. And the Hatchet lighting is 2 key lights on either side of the subject. We'll see if it picks that up. Maybe you can see that. It seems like it's got some lighting on the left and the right, but it still seems a little bit more like some of it's coming up. Yeah, it picked up the hatchet. I didn't even notice that. It picked up our axe, like our hatchet. That's really funny. This gets into a little bit of the fun around ambiguous terms, right? So one that I always like to comment on is like the word crane. So you might get crane the bird, you might get crane the construction equipment, you might get Ichabod crane. The way that the current text encoders work in SDXL, you have to be mindful of this kind of like ambiguous term because you're going to be pulling in these adjacent concepts. You can fight that. Like we could try adding axe to the negative prompt, and that's going to kind of like try to remove that axe component or like the tool component from it. And maybe that'll get that away and we just keep our lighting. Looks like that might have worked. But it's almost like word math, you know? It's you're trying to figure out what set of terms go in the positives and how you take away the right negative terms to disambiguate what you're trying to get. Someone said AI is word math, and yeah, it is. A few folks want to play around with the term HDR, so I'll just do that real quick. We'll switch out hatchet lighting for HDR and play around with that piece. But overall, I think we're starting to see a little bit of like the patterns here, right? What gets changed when we change the terminology and what doesn't. Someone said, if hatchet lighting doesn't work, split lighting might work. That will be a little bit less, get a little bit less axes involved in there. So our HDR generation, pretty decent. I mean, if we compare this to some of the other ones, we've got some nice details and color popping here. This is our split lighting. You know, see, we've got a little bit of like the right and some light on the left, so I can see that being okay. But the HDR, I think, has a nice element of contrast with color, right? Using that like HDR term can be a useful element. So if we play around with a couple of other terms that are often, the black leather jacket is satisfying a lot of the contrast requirement, is what person says. That's very true. What I'm going to play around with now are some other like photography terms that we can use. We can talk about the F stuff. So we can do, let's try F 2.8 versus, actually, let's do this. I'm going to keep HDR in here. And we'll do F 2.8, F4, and then F8. And so we're looking at kind of like the certain camera terms that are talking about like how much light, we're getting into the image as we generate, or as we take a photo, right? And so these are going to be understood in correlation with other photography that has been taken, and it shouldn't be too impactful because we haven't upweighted it, but we can play around with this kind of like this value here that is correlated with different aesthetics that can be generated. So honestly, I don't even see that much of a difference in these. So let's actually see what happens when we upweight this. We'll do 3, and then F4, and then F2. And this may just not be a good composition where this is going to actually get whole lot there. But look at these, you know, I would say largely the same. I think this is like one of those points where we can probably debate the merit of which of these actually even matters. And if we take this out completely, how does the F at all, adding the F stop in at all, influence the generation? And I think the answer there is going to be like minimal. This is also an interesting piece though. So we've got our 4 here that have this. I actually think I like the one without it best of all. But if we add this to the front, let's see if that changes. Because typically when you're looking at your prompt, terms that are added earlier are going to have a higher influence. The analogy I like to use again is it's kind of like peanut butter. When you start to spread it, more of this peanut butter is at the beginning, right? So you're kind of like spreading your attention over the prompt. And so the things that matter, the things that are core and central that you want the most attention towards should be at the front. And then as you go through, you can certainly add in a couple of like chunky bits by using upweight, right? So it's like you've got some pieces that are meaty later on in the prompt. But typically like one of your tools is bringing stuff earlier in that prompt. And so we'll try F2.8 and 4 and 8 up front. And this is out of pure curiosity to see how much of this is like the placebo effect of us having an influence over these things. Certainly had a bigger influence there. So this is F8, and I think this was our original F8 here. So it had a bigger influence at the beginning than at the end. But I don't know that we're seeing a whole lot of difference other than just it being there at all, right? Like having and this I think is like worth talking about. Having a f-stop value pushes you into the realm of a certain degree of photographic sophistication, right? Like you have an asset that has been captured with an f-stop in it, right? And just being in that realm is going to have this kind of like shift towards a certain style of photography. And that's kind of what it seems to be picking up. Yeah, exactly. Someone just said in chat, it's more about just having photographic terms. It's less specifically the value and more about just having the terms at all. It obviously has an impact. It's not like these are the exact same image, and we can probably get into aesthetic debates about the qualities of this. But I don't really think that these are changing on the dimension that you would expect the prompt term to have that influence for. And I think you could certainly teach a model to understand that. You could create a LoRa, for example, that has a bunch of data that's tagged with different f-stop values so that you can really teach it exactly what that looks like. If you really wanted to create a data set to teach a LoRa that, you'd take a photo of the same thing with different f-stops and like different angles and stuff like that, and it would really start to piece out like what exactly is different when I have that specific setting on a camera. What is the qualitative difference? Right now, as a few people have commented, it's just pushing us into the photographic realm of the latent space, which is valuable in and of itself for getting a certain quality, but it's going to be less important to have like the specifics. In this case, though, I think this one's F8. Oh, this is F2.8. I like this one. This one's the best. It's got like a smoky look. It's very GQ. So we've got a couple of different lighting things that we've played around with. I think these are more generic terms, and I think the thing that you can start to play around with are, you know, different additional aesthetic terms that you can bring in that'll give a more evocative kind of like look to it. So one thing that can be really interesting is we'll take some of this stuff out and we'll do a silhouette of a dancer Starry Night. I actually don't want to do Starry Night. If you do Starry Night, you're going to get some, like, you know, some artwork that goes by the same name. We'll do Sunset. Oh, and somebody actually threw in a cool image that I think we're going to use for this. Say moody lighting. Upweight that too. And take out this, leave HDR in, take out close up. Talk about ethereal illumination, gentle shadows, just, you know, going in, just fun stuff. Gradient effect. So somebody shared an image, and we're going to see if we can copy that in. So I think it'd be cool. So let me see here. I've got this image, and we're gonna have some fun with this because I've got some ideas. This is always fun when the chat brings their stuff to play around with. So we've got this gradient effect that somebody brought in, and I think it's like worth calling out. How might we use this? We're going to play around with this in two ways. So first, I'm just going to generate this image. I'm going to do maybe a 4:3, and I'm going to generate the image without any additional control layers or any images like that. So we're looking at our dancer silhouetted by the sunset. Cool. We got it. She maybe has an extra leg. It's okay. Playing around with lighting right now. We're not going to fiddle too much with like the anatomy because we know that could be fixed with something like in painting, but we're not going to do that right now. I will get nerd sniped and you'll go down a rabbit hole of me fiddling with this on the canvas for an hour. So we've got the lighting here. What happens when we add in an initial image? So we'll create a global initial image, and we will use this, and we're going to want this to be relatively high. What happens here, and we've talked about this in the past, but I'll just kind of like repeat it because I think it's interesting. When you are generating an image, you're taking kind of like raw noise, which is that white fuzz, that white and black fuzz that you see on a TV screen, and it's looking at that and kind of almost like looking at a cloud and trying to figure out how to make the prompt come from that cloud, right? It's like, okay, where you're telling me there's a dog here, I'm looking at a cloud, where can I see a dog? It's kind of that same game that we play with kids, right? When we use an initial image, what's actually happening is we're biasing or skewing that noise with colors and shadows and things like that. And so what's happening is we're making, with this initial image, we're making the noise darker along the outside and lighter on that core center of that gradient, right? And so that's going to have an effect. If it's not high enough of a denoising strength, we're just going to get a black and white image. So we've got to keep it pretty high. I think 0.85 is probably enough. The more pronounced of an effect you want on the lighting, the lower your denoising strength, right? Because that's going to keep more of that light and dark. And so we can see we've got our dancer now. We've got this kind of like very bright center where the sun is. It's almost imposing itself as the sun because that center of the gradient is the brightest spot. And so that's kind of where that's coming in. If we bring this up, I'm going to go all the way to 0.97. We should get a little bit more freedom away from that. It's still going to have the brightest spot there, but it should have a little bit more flexibility to create some more details. Yeah, still mostly the same. I'm going to turn it up all the way to 0.99, and then we're going to try something else just to get a little bit more control over this. Okay, so roughly the same, right? This is the maximum denoising strength that we can really go and still get much of an effect at all. So it's like almost the same at those two settings. So what's another way that we can apply this? Well, we can use, let's see, our control adapter with a tile control net. And this is another way of kind of imposing some amount of lighting without doing this. It's almost like a different way of getting this type of gradient control. So I will do 0.35 and we'll see what that looks like. This is different than just doing it on the noise. It's actually in the conditioning itself using this kind of like tiled mechanism. And what this can do is it can create contrast without necessarily imposing as much color influence, right? So it's not, we're saying this is black and white. We're instead saying this is kind of like where certain dark things should be, where certain light things should be. So obviously we've got this kind of like, in order to make sense of this tile, it is bringing this kind of like large, I don't even know what to call that. It's like wing dress, maybe. So instead of imposing the colors, you're actually using a different dimension almost to influence it. And it could be a way of thinking about structural composition with denoising is like the color and the influence that you get from color is one of the big reasons why the canvas can be interesting to play around with, because you can actually draw in using both color and the implied structure of that object being there to control the generation. When you're using something like a control net, you're influencing how the attention is being given to the image that's being generated. You're not necessarily saying that this is a black pixel because we brought the weight down. If we had this pretty high, it would actually make it a black pixel. We're using almost like a more contrast friendly way of imposing our ask, and primarily because we're not influencing the color here. We're just primarily saying this is going to be like a darker pixel when you're generating the ultimate image. So hopefully that makes sense. Open to questions there. We'll turn it down just a little bit more. Once you get below 0.3, you start to lose the influence almost entirely. And so we don't want to go too low there. But we'll give it a shot. It's got a similar influence in that it's still trying to respect this kind of like circular piece, but it's a little bit less egregious on kind of how wacky it looks. Like this looks a little bit more elegant, but we get this kind of lighting here. It's a little bit different of an effect. It certainly is on point with what we've got from a prompt perspective, but it's just another way of playing around and influencing this stuff. Something I haven't tried before, which we can just see how this would work, is a composition only IP adapter. Never done this before. We're experimenting live. It could be disastrous, and that's okay. That's kind of what this is for. We're experimenting together. Ultimately, I think it doesn't have much an effect at all. So we still have something that's like aligned, and it looks very similar to our original image too, right? What's interesting though is that it fixed this third leg. Like, I think objectively, this is a better image in many respects. So that's interesting, but I don't think there's really a whole lot to glean from that other than that we've made it different. Maybe this solves it, maybe it doesn't. Let's just try, okay, someone said style only. Let's see what happens when we do style only. I bet it's going to make it a black and white picture. I think that's like, didn't even do that. Interesting. I bet if we had it all the way up on style, it would probably be a black and white image. Let's see what happens when we keep that style only high. We'll do the same for composition just to have some comparison. Yeah, so when style only is up all the way, it definitely has a pretty interesting effect on kind of creating this like almost vignette effect of the image. It's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool effect. When we do composition only, trying to determine if this is just a normal strange motion of the body of a dancer or if this is like wacky broken arm. Generally speaking, though, I think that the composition only is not, it's not really doing a whole lot other than changing the image a little bit. Like, I don't think it's like dramatically useful as a tool as far as I can tell so far, at least with this like gradient type image. Somebody provided another image to play with, so we'll do that too, just to play around with it, and then we'll jump into some other terms before we wrap up. I'll just throw out there now, if there's anything that you want to experiment with, now is your time to ask. So we've got this gradient. We're going to do the same thing with the initial image. We'll turn this up to 0.95 and see what that does. And then we are going to do the same thing with the tile. And so when we use it as the initial image, it's trying to figure out how that can be light, right? So that is creating another one of these like clothing, pieces of clothing that's lit up by the light from behind. We're going to take that same asset and try that as a control net with 0.35. So we'll just keep this comparison the same. A little bit too low, I would say. Let's try amping that up to 0.5. There's a little bit of a light pattern there, but it's not as significant as we'd want. So we're going to turn that 0.5. And we can definitely see that's having an impact. That one's a little bit more of that kind of light stream look. So we can see that there's like a couple of interesting ways to play around with like lighting composition using inputs. So somebody is asking about controlling the colors in indoor lighting, something like 3-point lighting with a white key light, blue backlight, and a green fill light. I'm going to say that prompt likely won't work, but let's see what we can do with it. So we're going to say a man sitting in a cafe illuminated by 3-point lighting with a white key light, blue backlight, and green fill light. We're going to give it a shot. I don't think it's going to work. But we'll see. I think we're just going to see a bunch of random colors. So he's got a green jacket. That's about it, right? Like this didn't really do what we want it to do. I will even go so far as to prove my point by upweighting this. I don't think it's going to necessarily adhere to this prompt. And so this goes back to like, generally it's understanding of complicated compositions and asks. Right now, the model doesn't have that. Obviously, there's a lot of research going into improving prompt adherence. And in the future, I think we'll have a little bit more control using just text. But when we're doing something like this, I think where I would typically go is probably to the canvas So I'm just going to fill this with black. It's not black. Fill this with black. And then we'll do something like drawing in the colors that we want. And so we'll do this. Do like a blue backlight. Then a white light there. Just like outline this. What I'm trying to do is just like create some areas where there's those overlaps and kind of shapes and colors. We'll save that to the gallery. And we're going to use that as a style only IP adapter. Pretty low. And we'll give that a shot. I don't know if it's going to work. I'm just trying to figure out how to solve that problem, right? Might need to turn it up a little bit. We'll turn it up a little bit and see if we get more. I think we're getting closer to that type of like more aesthetic lighting. Someone's asking about, is there anything model trainers can do with SDXL to improve prompt adherence? Yes, there's a lot of work that could be done, but the quickest way to do it would be just training a new model. And that's kind of where some of the work around the open model initiative and making an open model that has that type of adherence. There's a lot of work in discussing how to drive that forward. I think ultimately control is the big question that we're trying to answer right now. And what are the avenues of control that make this useful for people and artists? So obviously too high, we got a little bit of like a blue hat thing going on. Ultimately, I think we're probably better off taking an image that has this type of aesthetic and using that as a style only. So I'm just going to do a quick Google search here and see if I can find an example of 3-point lighting to use. That way we've got style reference that we can point to. We'll try this. I think this is going to be a little bit off because color-wise, but we'll play around with it anyways because I think it's like a decent example of the type of stuff we're going for. So we'll add this in as a style. And it has like this aesthetic of skin being illuminated. Maybe our color is like actually overriding it, which would be interesting. I don't see as much green. I think we're maybe getting some of the other stuff that we want. Also try doing a plus here, seeing how that goes. But I think we're going to get more of the color from that when we, we're getting more of the color from the image that we're using. But you can see that's probably the easiest way to get some of these lighting effects if you provide an image that has those examples already in the image, right? So this is how the lighting looks. This is kind of the specific aesthetic. And the reason for that is these concepts exist in kind of this, like, we'll say this no man's land inside of the latent space that are just, it's hard to get to with words. Like it's got an understanding of it, but it's not accessible through the same terminology. That prompt adherence is really taking words that we would use and getting to the right spot inside of the model. That is what like prompt adherence really means, is like, what do we mean and what does the model know and how do we connect those two things? Images are a great vehicle when we don't have the words to articulate what the model might know. We can actually provide the image and say, this is what I'm talking about. And that can be a really useful tool. That's why IP adapter is so valuable. Style only, obviously a great way of getting just that aesthetic component without any of the underlying content. It's not looking at the person. It's not looking at a person holding lights. It's like really just taking some of that style piece. So that's a useful tool here. Yeah, someone said pictures worth 1,000 words, and I think that's true. Cool. Questions. If people have questions. Now that we focused on quite a couple of different topics today on lighting, we can just play around with some more aesthetic effects if we want to. We'll take this out, standing in a city street, and we're going to do something like curved light trails and long exposure. We'll do neon lights, maybe abstract dynamic curves, and then let's see, dreamlike, ethereal, aesthetic, artistic. Yeah, if we say it's artistic, it's art, right? We left our IP adapter in, but that's okay. Take that out and we'll do it without it too. It'll be good to see what we get. Okay, so we've got this guy walking in the streets. There's these weird neon lights that are curving around. It's neat. I think this was coming from a little bit of like the lady holding the lights. This guy though is now walking on the street, and he's got these like long exposure lights behind him, and it feels like it's a very like there's something moving in the image, right? Obviously some details that you'd fix in the canvas. I'm tempted. I'm going to do it. I'm just going to fix it. We'll go in and we'll like, fix up his face. And we'll fix up, we could fix up the hand. We could take out that sixth finger. But I think more important than his sixth finger are these shoes. We need a man with a sense of style. Fix these. Typically when I like editing the feet, I like to do IP adapter just so that it has a little bit of that kind of like, hey, I'm focusing on the feet right now, edit this piece. And that'll kind of create a little bit more compositional understanding of where the image is and what it's focusing on. And then we'll generate our new shoes. Be good to go. We're going to leave the sixth finger because I don't care about the sixth finger. A little bit small. It's okay. I'm going to fight it too much. So now we've got our guy walking through the street. Cool. We like that. So much better. So there's a lot of cool effects that you can get if you are looking at traditional photography terms. There was, I want to say, some large list of styles that a photographer put together. I think his name's Rob. I'm trying to remember the guy's name. Anyways, he's got a list that he posted and shared out to the community. I'll try to find a link and share it out in Discord and include it in the notes. But there's a ton of these kinds of like cheat sheets of photography terms and things that, yes, somebody just posted it as Rob Laughter style reference. There's a couple of interesting like terms in there that you can just add to your vocabulary. I would highly recommend looking up what they mean and kind of understanding each one in isolation so that you understand exactly what you're asking for. These are just interesting ways of getting a certain aesthetic and visual element. Obviously, there's a bunch of different ways to control light We've talked about a couple today. If we take, let's just do another example of our tile here. We'll do that same gradient we used before. And we'll maybe do 0.55. Just to kind of see how this same thing applied to a different prompt can convey different things, right? So we used this before on our dancer, and now we're using it on our man in the streets with his curvy lights. This is pretty high, so we've got a really dark image. Maybe we'll turn this down. It's kind of cool. It's just a little weird, but it's kind of cool. We'll turn that down just so that we get a little bit more of our prompt in there. We can also play around with the control type too. Structurally is interesting. We might want to like taper that off about halfway though. So it's getting a little bit too heavy-handed on the structure and adding in some artifacts. So basically what I'm doing here is it's creating a lot of the core structure for the first half, but then that last half it's lifting the control and it's just saying generate the image that's in the prompt, which is a useful way of fixing some of the more weird details that came in from that. It's taking in a lot of that structure of where the light's edges would be, but it's giving us kind of overall a prompt. Just for the sake of trying it out, we'll change the control to prompt to bias more towards the prompt. And we'll generate that also at a higher strength early on, just to play around with some options that maybe we don't give enough airtime to. Yeah, prompt bias there, I think, ended up looking a lot better because it looks a little bit more like our prompt and what we're going for. This new one that we're generating is going to be pretty interesting because we've got this kind of component here that still drives a lot of structure, but is still adheres to our prompt more, because this one was a little heavy-handed when it was just control focused, but this kind of adds an interesting look of like these lights that are being applied to it. So yeah, I think there's a lot of fun to be had with playing around with tile controls and lighting. Something to just experiment with, the different dimensions that you can really toy with, setting the control to the prompt so that it's not over imposing anything on the control image, playing around with that weight. If you're finding any artifacts later on in the image, or it's like too strong of a control towards the end, you can bring that in step down and that'll just kind of taper that off. So we'll go ahead and call it there for today. I'll answer any questions that people throw in last minute, but otherwise, thank you all for joining again for another fun experimentation and studio session of lighting. And next time we'll probably go through some upscaling workflows. Until then, take care.